It's good to have you here, and thanks for joining us. My name is Stephen Fetter. I manage the United Learning Program for the General Council, and I am delighted and thrilled to have you joining us from coast to coast to coast tonight. This is, as we were saying just before I turned the recording on, this is a three-part series, and we're really going to have a chance to roll up our sleeves and talk together and experiment and do some dreaming about the tools that we have available to us as citizens and as Christians and as church people and as people who just care about the world we live in and what's happening in it. So I am delighted and thrilled that you're wanting to come and be part of this three-part series, and I hope you find it is engaging. I hope you find it's fun. I hope it sparks your excitement for what's possible. Recognizing that it is the eve of the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, the eve of Orange Shirt Day that we have been acknowledging for years, recognizing that we need always to be mindful of our connection to the treaties that we're a part of, to the land that we live on, and to the people who nurtured this land and were nurtured by it long before my ancestors came to this country. I want to begin, before we jump into the meat of our conversation, by inviting you simply to acknowledge where you're sitting tonight and who lived in this land before your ancestors came, if there were others who did. Or if your ancestors have been here for 10,000 years, tell us that too. We'll just take a moment to watch in the chat as people acknowledge where you're sitting and where you're coming from. Some people have already started, and that's great. I'm not going to try to pronounce all the names. I would embarrass myself too quickly. And Cheri and I are both acknowledging the Mississaugas of the New Credit and Wendat and Haudenosaunee, the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant. So thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for knowing. Thank you for acknowledging the history and the nurture of the place where you have been. And so as the last ones come in on the chat, I invite us to pray together. Let us pray. Loving God, you have called us together from many treaties and many territories and many places across this whole continent. You have called us to a mission of hope and of change and of passion and of possibility. Come be with us tonight. Come be with us as we share tools, as we share experience, as we share stories, as we learn from each other and wonder and listen and discern about where you might be calling us next. Guide our conversation and keep us hopeful. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, let me bring up Cheri beside me. I'm not sure that Cheri needs a whole lot of introduction, especially for those of you who were with us when we launched her book or have seen her active in Ontario politics or just listen to one of the many different places she's been around on the web. But Cheri, it's great fun to be with you. Cheri is a United Church minister. She has been an Ontario politician. She is retired from politics, except not really. The The book that she wrote is a wonderful, luminous book, and the self-promoter that she is, she's already showing it to you behind her. And we'll give you a link at the United Church Bookstore where you can go to buy it if you haven't already picked it up. Cheri, it is always fun to have a conversation with you, and I'm so grateful to you for coming to do this.
A pleasure, Stephen, and all. Absolutely.
So when Cheri and I kind of planned for the book launch that we did together, we kind of skated through her whole career, and the book is really an autobiography with an emphasis on activism, but kind of telling you a sense of her story and where she comes from and her history. And we talked through some of that. But her passion is not really in telling stories about herself, although she's good at it. Her passion is in change, and in nurturing change, and in working to build coalitions to make life better for people. And so as we were planning the book launch and realized that that particular webinar was really about trying to push the book and encourage people to read it, she had all these other ideas that were bubbling up about how to encourage activism and how to sort of inject a sense of hope and practicality into some of the activism that the church does. And so we dreamed up this possibility of doing a series together where she can be the expert and I will ask the naive questions, because I am really good at naive questions. And she knows what she's talking about. So that's always worth listening to. But the purpose here is not so much to talk about Cheri's life as it is to kind of pick her brain on what she's learned, what works and what doesn't, and why it works, and how to do the next step. I think many of us in the church have struggled from time to time around what's really going to make a difference and what's going to change things. And we hear Jesus talking about the reign of Christ, and yet we're not sure how to get from A to B and what our role is in the middle of that. I have found in my conversations with Cheri that she has practical and pointed things to say about what we're doing well and sometimes even what we're not doing well. And so we wanted to share some of that. So the shape of this series, the first evening, we're going to be mostly Cheri and me talking, or Cheri talking and me asking those questions. But at the end of tonight, about an hour in, we're going to invite you to do some brainstorming with us around what are the issues you're passionate about? What do you care about? What are you working at? What would you like to work at? What are you struggling with in your own setting? And some of those issues are going to be national in scope, and some of them will be very local or regional or maybe provincial. We're going to together brainstorm those issues. We're going to put together a poll and see what bubbles up to the top, and let that polling and that brainstorming shape the next two sessions. So that next week we'll look at, I don't know, do you want to do national ones first or the local ones first, Cheri? Does it matter to you?
Oh, let's start big. Let's
okay, there you go.
We just had a federal election. Let's go there.
Perfect. Sounds good. So we'll do some thinking about one national issue. Not that it's the only one we ever care about, but we'll use that as a kind of case study to talk about what we might do. What are the possibilities? Who would we talk to? Where would we go? How would we pull the levers of power that are available to an activist? And then we'll do it all again the following week, but with a very local issue or a regional or a provincial one, whichever one's kind of bubbled up. So as we move through the intro part tonight, ask your questions. By all means, please do use the chat. There are 26 of us online, so just opening the mics and having a free-for-all isn't going to work. But use the chat and ask as many questions as you can, and I'll just keep feeding them in. But also in the back of your mind, think about what you're doing and what you care about, what matters to you, what change are you working at, so that when it comes time to do that brainstorming, we don't just have this dead air, but we've got too many ideas to include, and that'll make the rest of the evening kind of move quickly and be fun too. So that's the shape of the evening. use the chat. You already have been doing that. And as I say, I'll watch it and feed things in. Cheri, I gave a real thumbnail sketch of why we've invited you into doing this, but tell us a little more about how you got into this and what's your background in activism?
I've always been a social justice activist, so I did it's actually a 20th anniversary of the first Canadian legalized same-sex marriage that I performed in 2001, just before the law changed. Holy Spirit at work there. And so that shows that I've been around for a while. I was also at the first gay demo in 1971 and the first Pride. So yeah, been around for a bit. But people know me mainly for getting elected, and that was in 2006. I had never had a real focus or drive to be a politician or to sit in one of those seats in any legislature. But I was asked by the party if I would consider running, and I wasn't even a formal member then. They asked me for one simple reason: they thought I could win, and that's one of the areas we're going to be looking at as we talk about activism. Is not only how to win, but what motivates politicians to help them, and help us. Once I was in politics, after I got the lay of the land, and believe me, there's no such thing as a lazy politician or a politician just in it for the money, because most of them, being a lot of lawyers, could make more money somewhere else. And you work nonstop in politics. But figuring out all the arcane rules and how the place worked, I managed in the almost 12 years that I was there to pass more private members' bills than anybody in Ontario's history. And I was a backbencher in a third party. And more LGBTQ pieces of legislation than anybody in Canadian history, which wasn't a hard thing to do because there was so little, but there it stands. So I learned a few things doing that over the years, how to do it, and I never, of course, did it alone. And so you are the activists gathered here tonight, and each one of the bills that has my name on it has an activist behind it, at least one, sometimes several. But it really are, it's those people that change everything. So I guess that's one of the messages. It's you that changes everything, using politicians to get it done. So I'll stop there. Continue on, Stephen, with your questions.
Well, I mean, that's just such a neat way to start, because I have a sense, talking to a lot of the activists in the church, that they really think nobody's listening, or that if they're listening, they don't want to hear from churches. They look at churches as being archaic and fuddy-duddy and old-fashioned. But I think we don't have a sense that we're powerful at all. I think we have a sense that nobody cares. The moderators no longer get calls from the prime minister asking about legislation that's coming in. I know they used to in the 30s. They don't anymore. The conferences used to pass high-sounding motions at conference about various different world issues, and we would send letters and not even get an acknowledgement. And you wonder whether any of this matters or anybody cares. Is anybody listening, even if we try to do this stuff?
Absolutely they are. First of all, let me tell you that religion is powerful in politics. Not that you probably didn't already know that. You only have to look south of the border to know what's happened with the evangelical right wing in terms of their move into politics, which has shifted dramatically what the American political spectrum looks like. Up here, it's just as profound. There are almost permanent lobbyists from other religious groups, Salvation Army for one, Canadian Jewish Congress for another. We know the name of Charles McVitie because he has such an influence over Doug Ford and Ford's government. Religion is in politics. The question is progressive, progressive faith in politics? And earlier I said to Stephen, what we should remember is the United Church of Canada is the largest Protestant denomination in Canada. I know we've lost members and we're losing members, but we still are. We are in our districts and ridings one of the major community centers for that riding. And we speak on Sundays, maybe not to a lot of people, but the influence of the people who are there is profound. And politicians will pay attention to us if we speak to them because we represent votes. So first of all, we have to understand that we have that power as an institution and as individual congregations, and also that we have that power as individuals. That squeaky wheels, as they say, we can be those voices. And every politician knows the voices attached to issues in their ridings. They know them because they're at the mic for all candidates' meetings. They know them because they bug their staff. They know them because they're in their office and wanting a meeting. And they will respond to both clergy and people in congregations because they know that you're part of a considerable voter bloc. So use that power, but first of all, feel that power. And maybe I can just give you an example of one brilliant activist in my life who at the time was on ODSP, which is social services in Ontario for disabilities. It actually condemns you to live below the poverty line. It's ridiculously low. But she was a trans activist who lived on that and simply made it a function of her being to work for trans rights. She was one of the first people who came to see me in my office when I was elected. She didn't just stop with me. She went to see every politician that would give her time. And she became the voice and the face of trans rights. She certainly was behind, in part, one of the first major tri-party bills ever passed in Canada, which was Toby's Act, named after my music director, trans music director at my then church. That added gender identity and gender expression to the Ontario Human Rights Code in 2012. It took us a while to get it passed. And when I'm talking about trans rights, don't think big demonstrations. She said in a recent interview that I did for my next book, she said at most we could get 4 or 5 people out to our demonstrations. So we're not talking about a lot of people. We're talking about a few very determined people. And a person like me somewhere in the political spectrum that will listen. So we can talk more about that as we go along. But next question, Stephen.
Well, yeah, I love the stories and just keep bringing them in because they ground it, right? It stops being abstract that way. But I guess I want to push back a little. You know, we in my church applied for a grant to get the place handicap accessible. And we had to have the Montessori school in the basement front the grant for us because as a church, we weren't eligible for monies that the Montessori school was eligible for. Mm-hmm. So there seems to be built into the system a bias that you don't want to support churches. And I wonder whether that dampens us when we try to do any kind of activism too.
I would push back a little bit. We do not pay taxes as churches. And believe me, there is a movement out there in the secular world to make us pay taxes. Mm-hmm. We are given a huge break that other institutions are not given. And so there is that, but also we do have power. I mean, the richest church in North America is the Salvation Army, interestingly enough. They own more property than any other single denomination or faith. And how did they do it? They did it by being involved with government and doing what's called private-public partnerships. So they and the government would buy a building, they would house a shelter or a food bank, usually shelters, and eventually that land would cede to them. When I think of the advantages that our churches, I mean, we're on the eve of Truth and Reconciliation Day. Look at what churches have done in this country, mostly for ill, sometimes for good. Certainly churches have power. The question is, how do we use that power? I mean, the College of Bishops sends representatives to Queen's Park and will be certainly for the inauguration of the new government in Ottawa. They will be sitting there. So will the Canadian Jewish Congress be sitting there in the audience, in the legislature. This is routine, and just about every other faith group, Islamophobic bills that have gone forward, or anti-Islamophobia bills that have gone forward, have been inspired by imams in mosques who are very much there. Sikhs are very involved. Tibetan Buddhists are very involved in government. We have a Tibet Day that I started as an organizer for them at Queen's Park, and there's one in Ottawa. So various faith groups are very involved. We as United Church are just not very involved, which is, I think, a sadness for me personally, and should be for all of us. But it hasn't always been the case. We were involved, and I think we can be involved again. And our voice is desperately needed. It's needed, first of all, as a counterweight to the voices on the right in Christianity. And second of all, it's needed as a progressive voice for social justice change. And so that's what I'm hoping to inspire a little bit of. Yeah.
You think some of these ceremonial events, like going to the opening of Parliament, just being there matters?
Oh, yeah. Lobbyists, those who are paid by multinationals and others to lobby politicians who give lots of money and spend lots of money, they are always there. They have lobby days, and they're present. They're present at pressers that have bills that concern them. They try to be there when policy is even written by those that write policy. And this is true both south and north of the border. And lots of nonprofits have lobby days too. In fact, there's a lobby day, not so much, of course, during COVID, hasn't happened, but it will pick up again once COVID ends. At Queen's Park in Ontario, every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, when the House sits, and there's some group there represented. A lot of them are nonprofits, some of them are profits. So lobbying works, but you don't have to spend money, is the point that I'm going to make over the next few sessions here. And in fact, a lot of that money that lobbyists spend is completely wasted. I mean, this is how I ate for many, many years. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night, jumbo shrimps and a free and open bar. And half the time we didn't even know who was sponsoring it, and we didn't really care because we were talking to each other and we were getting caught up on our stuff of the day, and we were negotiating with each other. We used that time to get together across party lines as politicians in that small town. So it's not necessarily an efficient way of lobbying. There are much more efficient ways, and there are, of course, much cheaper ways. So we'll talk about those.
I often get a sense out of the press that lobbying is a dirty word or a bad thing to do, or people are suspicious of lobbyists. It sounds like you think this is a good thing.
Absolutely, it's a good thing. The reason is it puts us off, the term, is that we associate it with big lobby firms. But the most effective lobbyists, in my experience, have been individuals with very little to no obvious power and no money. So I'll tell you another little quick story of a woman who walked into my constituency office, and she came to the attention of one of my staff who brought her to my attention. She was a paramedic. She had been off on leave because she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and she could not get workman's compensation, what we used to call workman's compensation, because she couldn't prove that her PTSD came from her job, even though she was sent into traumatic situations every single day that she was working. It was not just true of paramedics and her, it was also true of all first responders right across the spectrum who suffer from incredibly large amounts of PTSD. So I basically took that up as a cause because I thought it was worthy. And also for various reasons, because I thought we could get it done. It took a number of years, but she was the face behind it. And because she suffered from PTSD, it was really, tricky. And during the course of fighting for that bill, which eventually became law for all first responders, we would get calls from people threatening suicide, firefighters, correction workers, you name it, that we would then have to say, I'm sorry, we're going to have to report this. And I remember one firefighter phoned in threatening suicide, and he said, please don't call this in because, my friends will be forced to come to my house, and that actually dissuaded him from trying to kill himself. So these bills and laws have profound effects on people's lives. And at any rate, when that bill finally became law, it was her name Shannon Bertrand, and she's going to be in my next book. But she came to the gala, and she was there, and all of a sudden, I remember it very well, sadly and gladly, that a whole, about 40 different press people descended on her with microphones and cameras. A woman who's suffering from PTSD. She was incredibly amazing and managed to answer the questions, even though they got personal and horrible. But it's people like her that change laws.
So this is a very different kind of lobbying than sending the moderator to the opening of Parliament. And maybe we should be doing that too, but you
should be doing that too.
That anybody on the call here can do.
Yeah, we should be doing that too, because in terms of faith representation, they should know who the moderator is. And I talked to Richard and said, you should do that. So yeah, the moderator should be turning up and being a presence at these events, but that he's not there, it does not stop us. We should be turning up and having a presence at those events. Because why? Because we've got to know the people who represent us, and they've got to know us, and we will get invited to those events. I would invite activists with gallery passes to those events that I knew were interested in changing the world and changing laws. So if you have a politician like me in your riding, and you can all have a politician like me in your riding if you get to know them, you will get passes to sit in those spaces. And you will get to know those places, and you will get to know the people in them and the staff in them, and be able to make changes that way.
There's a challenge for sure. Because I think sometimes we've assumed that it's the responsibility of the policy wonks in Toronto to do our lobbying on behalf of the denomination. You're saying this is very much a grassroots thing.
Absolutely. And I have to say, sadly, that I never saw the United Church at anything when I was in almost my 12 years, until I asked them. If I'd asked them, they'd show up. That's not the way it works. You got to show, you got to want to be there. I remember, and this is, I remember when the very first bill I tabled was a $10 minimum wage. The minimum wage had been $8 in Ontario for many, many years. So I tabled a bill saying that it should be 10. And this huge, mainly inspired and led by Labour, campaign developed around that, just like it did later for the $15 minimum wage. And it went right across the province. We finally won that. And I remember I was close enough to the church. I just left ministry in the classic sense into a seconded ministry in the political sense. And so I remember asking, the conference at that point to back me up, to write a letter, because other organizations had supporting the $10 minimum wage. I did finally get a letter. I got a letter about 6 months after the bill had become law. So there's a story.
Oh dear.
So we can do better, folks. We can do better.
That story.
We can do better.
I have sadly heard that from other politicians too, other United Church ministers in Holland.
Yes, like my friend Rob Oliphant. Yeah. So
one of the things I notice about the bills that you've got behind, and you've mentioned some of them tonight, and there's more in your book, is that they're very focused. I mean, you have inside you, I think, this passion for the reign of Christ, and to use theological language, but you're creating a bill for a $10 minimum wage, or to change trans rights in a very specific way, or to ban conversion therapy. I mean, you hone in on something very specific. Talk to us about how you choose what you're working at, and how do you focus it that tightly?
Sure. Well, again, I want to throw it back to you, everyone here, because as just as I described for Susan and Shannon, every bill that I've championed has had a face behind it. Of course, I'm passionate about issues around poverty, issues around class, issues around gender and sexuality, and of course, these are pet issues of mine. But it was always someone out there saying this is what we need. So banning conversion therapy, I didn't even realize that it was still going on in our province. And this was, I had no idea. I was traveling with a committee for gay straight alliances, which were just becoming mandated in our public education system. And people would come and testify before that committee. And I remember a group of psychiatrists came and said their entire practice was on conversion therapy. That was in Ottawa, for Ottawa folk here. And we were just shocked. All of us on the committee were shocked by that. Then we were in Sudbury, and a terrific group called TJ Inner Cells, or basically Trans Inner Cells group up in Sudbury, a trans group, again, very small. I think they had about 6 or 7 people in the organization. I said, okay, so what do you folk need? Like, what can I do? And they said, we need to ban conversion therapy because it's being practiced in some of our largest institutions. I can't name names still, but so I said, yes, let's do it. That bill, by the way, took 2 weeks to pass. Wow. From inception to, I think it took it a week or 2 longer to get, the Governor General's signature, Her Majesty's signature on it. But yeah, it was really fast because I managed to get the Premier of the time, Kathleen Wynne, to back me up on it. But, here's the thing. So those bills, even those bills that seem like pet projects to me, weren't. They really did come at me through activists who simply let me know what they needed. And, and I'm not alone. There are many politicians like me, and there are politicians in all parties. For example, to go back to the gender identity one, was signed on by Christine Elliott, our Deputy Premier and Minister of Health. Conservative, we don't agree on much ideologically, but she signed on to that bill. She signed on to the Trans Day of Remembrance. So I was speaking to a trans activist just the other day, who's working at CAMH, and he said, so how should I go about getting some of this policy into place? I told him the same thing. Meet with her, meet with John Tory, because he actually has an in there, and do it that way. So do not, another message, don't think that you can only get action out of your political party or your affiliates. Really be nonpartisan when you're trying to change the world.
So let me just pause for a moment and
Sure.
remind everybody listening that the chat is open, and I would love to have some questions from you to throw Cheri's way. So far, nobody has taken the time to write. I think you're probably just trying to pick your chin up off the table and think as quickly as Cheri does. But use the chat, and I'm delighted to throw her way anything that comes out of it.
Yeah, no stupid questions, obviously. We're all learning, right?
Oh, and I'm quite happy to say all of mine are naive, and that's just fine. But you're painting a picture of politicians here who almost depend on activists. Now, that is not a way I had ever thought of politicians before.
Politicians absolutely depend on activists. It depends what their ideology is, of course, on what activists they depend. But every politician, one common denominator is politicians want to get reelected. That's no surprise to anyone. So they particularly pay attention to people in their own districts or ridings. Because you actually vote for them, and every vote counts. As we saw in this last election, every single vote counts. Oh, yeah. So they care about what you think. So usually the first visit is to your elected representatives, no matter who they are, in terms of trying to get something on the table. And they do care, and they want to hear. And if not them, their staff, and their staff will weed out what they think they want to hear. And we can go into this in more detail in the upcoming sessions, but what you really want to get out of your representative is honesty. You want an honest answer. I learned this, to kind of put my cards on the table because I was so green and such a novice. I didn't know you shouldn't do that. So I just did when people came asking me for stuff, right? It's very easy to table a first reading bill. And that can be good because it can be a rallying point for an issue. But you really have to get through second reading. You have to make it law to have impact and to start saving lives. And I always like to think that good law is about saving lives because it does. So how do you get there? And so a politician can tell you, or their senior staff can tell you, what that looks like, how possible it is in the current political climate, what might get through and what might not. So I always knew when I was going into a second reading situation, which bill had the greatest likelihood of passing. They were all worthy, but which one I could actually get through. And then from there, I knew pretty much, although I occasionally was surprised, what could actually become law. Because I knew the government that I was dealing with. I knew the people around the cabinet table there. I knew who would champion it on that side and with the Conservatives. And I knew how I could, work with those folk to make it so. Politicians who work in, these are small towns they work in, right? The federal government's a little bigger town, but still a small town, like 600 and so people, okay? Provincial government's even smaller, under 200 usually. So these are small towns, and the people in them get to know everybody in them and get to know who they can work with or not. So you need to find your champion. So that's another theme. Find a champion.
And that's where I was going to go next. Is how do you identify a champion? What can a champion do for you?
Well, first of all, start where you are, I would say, with your local representatives. But then do your research. Figure out who's there, who has championed issues that that you feel powerfully about. And whatever your passion is as an issue, and issues should have some passion behind them, then find somebody whose passion aligns with that. It might not be in your riding, might not be close to you, might be across the country, but find that person, especially since we're looking at federal issues first. Find that person and find out how to work with them around your joint passion. That's ideal. And yeah, it might take some doing, but we can talk about how to do that when we get down to the casework.
Sure. And I'm going to bring in a question now, Laura and Jeffrey. I'm going to hold your questions because they're going to fit better in a few minutes. But Laura Gallagher-Doucette has an interesting comment. I'm just going to read it because the people who watch the recording won't see the chat anyway, Cheri. This is something she says that I'm starting to work through by trial and error, but sometimes I'm reticent to call politicians or write them when I don't know if I'll be able to make the case for something in an articulate or convincing way. The voice that holds me back might be, quote, I care about this issue, but I don't know enough about it to advocate for it. Beyond doing ongoing research to learn more, do you have any tips for this? Should this insecurity hold people back from entering the conversation?
Absolutely not. Politicians, just people like you and me, right? Their staff are just people with jobs like you and me. That's who they are. They're your neighbors, probably where you live, if you're going to your local representatives first. And you'll almost inevitably start with their staff. So these are just your neighbors. You want to get to know your neighbors. People used to pop into our riding office just to have coffee. I mean, seriously, a riding office should be a place where you pop in to have coffee, sign. Most politicians have petitions on the walls that you can sign while you're there. You can chat with who's ever on reception that day. I mean, this should be as comfortable to you as your coffee shop that you hang out in. Make it so, and they will get to know you. And developing relationships, just like everything else we do in life, is a really good way of breaking through any nervousness. And trust me, most advocates and change agents and activists who actually get laws changed are not the most articulate, best, I mean, professional lobbyists are hired for that purpose. But activists and change agents don't have to be professional lobbyists, as we've just been talking about. They're just people. They come in with issues, and almost immediately you can tell, and staff can tell if the issue is something that can go anywhere. And they will tell you that. And you just want a straight answer from them. Or they will tell you, okay, oh, that's interesting. Well, did you know that there's this group in your area that are working on exactly the same thing? You should hook up with them. Because again, more people, more power. Or they'll tell you, oh, yes, well, we tried that 3 years ago, and this is what happened. Or it's been tried over here, and this is what they found. They will give you the background around that issue if they're knowledgeable at all, if you can get some time with them. And you should be able to get some time at least with staff, because remember, provincial staff deal mainly with housing issues. They're bogged down with housing issues, trying to find people housing, like pushing their application up an inch on the pile, and federal staff are bogged down with immigration issues. So often if somebody comes in with an issue that's not immigration or just trying to find a house for themselves, they're delighted to talk about something different, right? Think about yourself. You're sitting at a desk job. You're surrounded by huge need. You're fighting with bureaucracies all the time, which, by the way, they have backdoor numbers for, so they can get through faster. So even when you're dealing with congregants who have issues, those offices are really helpful because they have those backdoor numbers, and they know the bureaucrats because they've been working with them. So they can get answers much faster than somebody sitting on hold for a long time, right? So again, make these folk your neighbors.
But what if you're in a riding where the politician is ideologically opposed to what we stand for?
Absolutely.
Or you just don't feel like you can connect with this person because they're in a party that isn't yours.
Yeah. Well, when I was in politics, I'm no longer privy to this because I've been pretty vocal in my attacks on the Ford government since I've been out of politics. But when I was in politics, you're working in a small town, you all get along. I've had conservatives in my house singing karaoke, who I disagree with, who are now in the current cabinet, right? But I gave you the story about Christine Elliott. So you never know. The point is, we're Christians and we're supposed to love our enemies, right? So if it's an enemy's office that you're walking into, remember to love them a bit. I mean, all politicians need some help. I mean, it's not a fun job. You're attacked all the time. They need pastoral care. Trust me, they do, all of them. So be the pastoral caregiver. There was a wonderful evangelical woman, I tell the story in my book, that used to come and just hang out in the galleries at Queen's Park. She wasn't paid for it at all. She did this. She saw it as her ministry to pray with people who would just let them into her office to pray with them. I'm sure we disagreed about lots, but I really enjoyed her coming into my office and praying with me. Cheri, what would you like to pray about today? I mean, pastoral care is greatly needed in political life, and you could be that pastoral care person. And it's amazing what people who are loved can do and how they can change, right? You never know.
What you're reminding me of is how much decisions in the church turn on relationship. It sounds like secular politics is no different.
It's absolutely no different. But of course, I mean, there is always that drumbeat of having to win and strategically wanting to win, right? So that goes on, but that goes on in professional life too.
Sure, it does. It may be a little less overt in church politics, I think. But maybe we have skills from wending our way through church politics that we weren't even realizing would be useful in this other sphere.
Should we go through some of these questions?
I think we should.
Yeah.
So let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of it here, because I think some people have some really good questions. Jeffrey Dale is asking about how COVID changes things, and how do you show up? How do you build these relationships? How do you do a demonstration? How do you make your voice heard when you have to wear a mask and you can't leave the house?
Zoom. Politicians are now meeting on Zoom, just like we are, right? I mean,
Wow.
that's how they meet with their constituents. I always say I would always say to volunteers, for example, in our area, that if they wanted to get involved and they, had a political bias and they wanted to get involved in politics, go volunteer in an election campaign. That's a really fast way of getting to know your local representative when you're out in the hustings with them. But for our purposes here, where we're trying to stay as somewhat nonpartisan, then just contact their staff, meet with them online. You can now, I think, in some offices are open, some are not, depending on the person. But get to know their staff, get to know them. Again, that's where the relationship building begins. And don't worry about how you sound or being organized or I mean, often we would live in fear of the people that came with big binders with color coding in it because I mean, often, well, often it was, first of all, politicians are very busy people. So if you're going to give them something to read, it better be one page in bullet form. It was always my gripe with the library at Queen's Park, at the legislature, that they were fabulous people. If you asked them for information, they'd give you a doctoral dissertation when all you really wanted was one page with bullet points and partisan ones at that. So you quickly learn that that's not going to work for you. But for sure, just develop relationships there, and again, do your research before all of this to find out who might be a potential champion for the issue that you're interested in.
So Laura Stewart brings up a good point. One of the common strategies that church activists have employed is to go and work within their congregation, get their congregational church board to pass a motion about something. Is this useful? And Laura says, do these help convey a sense that the position has broad support? Is it a good idea, or should we put our energies elsewhere? What do you think?
I'm sort of shotgun about these things. The same with petitions. You should know that petitions with your emails on them and addresses on are mainly and mostly used by politicians to add to their mailing lists. Just so you know. They're a way of gathering data. They are presented, but they work. Petitions tend to work only in huge numbers. When you get huge numbers of people signing on to a petition, then what you're providing for the politicians are a de facto poll, right? Now with social media being what it is, you can accomplish some of the same thing just by being on Twitter and starting a Twitter fire, or, I remember pre-use of social media, it would take about 100,000 signatures to really get action on a petition. So think about that. Not worth doing. Absolutely. It's easy, right? Sign a name. But there's so much more you could be doing than that. Letters, the same. Letters from congregations will get polite letters back that will be a version of a form letter, usually. Written by a staffer, almost certainly, and simply signed along with another 30 to 40 letters on their desk by the politician to send back. It's just good public relations. Will it get action? Again, it's worth doing, but don't stop there. All of these things, don't stop there, would be the cautionary note. Being the face, the personal face on an issue, I think carries way more weight. And be the spokesperson for your congregation in doing that. Again, if you want to look at the way the expensive lobbyists work for the multinationals, that's what they do. They don't write petitions and they don't write letters. They want personal appointments with people, and they get them because they got a lot of money. You can get them without any money and use the same technique. And the other piece of this, which we haven't mentioned yet, is course press. And I'm not putting my former colleagues down, and I'll say most politicians would think about at least leasing their mother for about 15 minutes on primetime television. So, I mean, think about it. If you can get press over an issue, and again, it doesn't, that's quirky, but it doesn't develop a relationship with the press. But it's not impossible at all. I was at a demonstration just about a week ago, organized by a doctor out of Ottawa, Neely Kaplan-Murth, who maybe Ottawa folk know. She's been very active on Twitter and active around COVID. And this was for school safety before school started. And so we were outside Queen's Park. There were maybe, I don't know, 6, 7 people in the demonstration. There were a couple of doctors. I spoke up, some politicians from, all parties. And there were about 20 press. There was more press than people. So it doesn't take a lot of people. Sometimes it's about the issue, about the setting, and about the timing. And so in our casework, we can look at the issue and what the setting and timing might look like to get press out to that. Once you've got press, it's much, much easier to get the politicians' ear. In fact, inviting them to speak is a good thing to do. So I mean, there's more, but we can stop there for now.
I wouldn't have the first faint clue how to call a press conference and call something that anybody might want to attend. Does press care about what we think? Why would they come to a press conference that I call?
I would say, I would say that probably every 2 weeks, just because I'm on Twitter a lot, every 2 weeks I get a call from press on Twitter, not necessarily from me, but saying who will speak to us about this issue. Journalists are always trying to find the personal story. They're trying to find you. They're trying to find that activist, that change agent who will speak with passion about an issue that's close to them, that they know something about. They're always looking for that. And so I will then direct them on to somebody else I know, 9 times out of 10. So this happens. So you're kind of making their job easier. And it's very easy to send out a press release. A press release, again, is 1 paragraph sent to a whole bunch of different places. That's what a press release is. Again, this is the kind of thing, yes, it might, to Laura Gallagher-Doucette's earlier question, could it have a church name at the bottom of it? It could. It should have a something name, not just yours when you're sending out a press release, but again, wherever the group is that group, that's the face of your issue, that can help. And then setting up a time where the press can come. And I've been at lots and lots of press, releases and demonstrations where no press was there, and then quirkily lots of press there, and there's no real way of knowing because of the press cycle. Who knows what happens in the world that day? But it might be a slow news day, and you might get press. So it's always worth doing, because what does it take? It takes sending off 1 piece of paper, right? And then showing up somewhere where, even if it's just you practicing how to speak at a presser, it's still good practice. And you can record it, by the way, now, and you can send the recording into the press so that they can sometimes clip that, which is also useful.
Very interesting comment that what the press are looking for is to talk to people who aren't pros at this.
Of course, think about it. And of course, politicians have that edge, but not always. I mean, look at who you see. I mean, CP24, for example, look at who you see there speaking about issues. It's inevitably somebody who's living them. And now and then a politician, right?
So what if you feel like you're a voice in the wilderness? I mean, Jonathan Worrell's writing a note here. He says, I hesitate to ask this, but as a minister of a progressive denomination in Saskatchewan, which is blue country, how effective will our voice be in local grassroots initiatives?
Profoundly effective. Profoundly. I mean, be there, show up. Let them know what you think. I mean, in terms of grassroots initiatives, I'm thinking local, which is something we can speak about in one of these sessions, but and that's even easier, actually, in many ways, depending on what your local council looks like, who the local what the local political formation is. But getting to know your city councillor, is every bit as easy, if not easier, because they usually have constituency hours that you can go and just chat to them, talk to their staff again, do exactly what I've just been talking about, whether it's to an MP, whether it's to an MLA or an MPP, or whether it's to a councillor. It's the same process, right? It depends on the issue who you should be speaking.
And I think that leads into Jeffrey's question, which is the last one on the chat right now. So folks, if you have more questions, start typing. But Jeffrey's wondering, I wonder about rural communities and advocacy. He says, so often in rural situations, there's 4 levels of government, and the township will often try to pass things off to the county, who pass it on to the province. And so when rural communities want to engage their local politics, especially in social issues, do you have any advice for how they might ensure that their most local representatives, the township or the county ones, see social concern engagement as also a part of their responsibility in addition to sewers and garbage collection?
Sure. Well, first of all, make sure that you know where your issue lies. Like, if you want to write a law, is it provincial? Is it federal? Is it local? So there's that. But also keep in mind that there's no such thing as nonpartisanship at any level of government, right? So that's kind of basic research. Are they conservatives around you? Are they liberals around you? Are they NDPers around you? Are they Green? Are they Bloc? Wherever you are, know what the partisanship is. I can tell you the partisan affiliation of every person on Toronto Council, for example, even though they're not supposed to have any. So they too operate within their own party orb, right? So be aware of that when you're approaching them. So when you're looking for a kind of champion for your issue, and it can be a champion that's not directly related. In other words, you might have a county clerk, who just thinks, yes, that's what I want to get excited about. You could have a staff person who says, absolutely. I mean, for example, I moderated a panel this week for Word on the Street for authors of a book arguing for basic income. Something that the United Church as a denomination has supported, a guaranteed livable income. So I asked them, how did you ever get the pilot project off the ground? 4,000 people got a livable basic income, and everyone who was on social assistance in Lindsay got a livable basic income for a while until Ford canceled the program. But how did they get it in the first place? It's such a wild card thing to get in a budget of a government, because it had to be budgeted. And who was your champion? Well, it turns out the champion was a staffer in the then Liberal government's office who just felt really strongly about this issue and got it to their government, in this case Kathleen Wynne, and she put it in the budget. I mean, they were as shocked as everybody else that it actually got done. So again, you never know. Could be a staffer, could be somebody local who just decides that they're going to take it up the chain, which is why it's good to know their partisanship, because you'll know how much clout they might have. And quite frankly, in Ontario, where a lot of those are conservative, you might find a champion that would be willing to take your issue, up a level, right? Up a couple of levels. Might have a contact, might have a friend in the party. So again, it does, as Stephen mentioned before, this is human relationships where we're talking about. So you never know where you might find your champion, but doing a little bit of research first helps.
I guess this is part of the advantage of making your action item really pointed. I mean, you managed to get tripartisan agreement around a minimum wage, or trans rights, or banning conversion therapy. It wasn't that you wanted to get tri-party agreement to everything on the NDP platform, but because it was so focused, you were able to cross party lines and find allies and champions in different parties. So maybe to Jonathan then in Saskatchewan, there are local concerns that are so clear and obvious that who's hurting, that it wouldn't matter that people disagree with you on 10,000 other Tory platform products. This particular one might get some traction. Is that what you're telling us? Is that what you're trying to help us understand?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, every bill is slightly different. I mean, the $10 minimum wage bill had a huge labor component behind it. So eventually did the PTSD. So that helps. So one thing I would say is know who might be your allies on an issue. The bigger the better, obviously. But for example, if labor unions routinely and have professionals who do this just like large companies do, who might get behind an issue that you want to champion. And then you've got this huge force and money behind you as well. So that was the case with the $10 minimum wage, which was clearly a labor issue. And PTSD had all these huge first responders unions ultimately got behind it too. So there's that. But others, like the trans rights, had a few people behind it, or banning conversion therapy, a few people, but had broad implications, and most pointedly, got passed before Pride. So do politicians want to get reelected? Yes, they do. And they do not want in a big Pride parade signs saying, you didn't do this. They want signs saying, you did. We did it. So make it easy for them. But yes, I think whatever the issue is, find out who ultimately has a say on it, find out a champion, and then another one, and then finally the champion you need is the one who's at that level of government that can actually get the job done.
So we're going to take another 7 or 8 minutes in this kind of conversational mode, and then we're going to start doing some brainstorming around issues to look at in the next 2 weeks. So just to kind of prime the pump again, if you're ready, we'll take those comments in a few minutes. But right now, last minute questions, and your kick at the can at Cheri for some of this intro stuff.
Well, there's a couple here maybe.
There's some really important ones. I mean, I was going to pick up Bonnie Halliday's next. Like, this sounds like it's going to take an enormous amount of time, and lots of us are only part-time in ministry now. Like. Yeah. How do you manage all of this and preach a sermon on Sunday?
Okay, well, follow your bliss. Truly, I mean, follow your passion. Like, it's amazing. We always find time for things that we enjoy, right? This has to be something that really drives you, that you feel passionate about. That, and it can, it can be really engaging. Make it your hobby. Make it your hobby to change a law. And it can be really, trust me, there's no better feeling truly than seeing, something become law and save lives. One of the greatest gifts that I was ever given in my political days was a book. It was about yay thick. It was about 2 years after Toby's Law adding trans rights to the Ontario Human Rights Code passed. And it was case law on cases based on Toby's Law, where people, got satisfaction from horrible employers or got recompense, or, it was great, like people's lives are being saved and changed by that law. It's a good thing. So don't make the time, want the time to spend on this is the way I would rephrase that. Wow. And a question about Palestinian rights, which is a really interesting subject.
Great, go for it.
Yeah,
that's such a tough one. I mean,
it is. It's a sure political minefield for every politician who's ever put a toe into it. And why is that? Let me tell you why it is, in part, because there's such huge lobby interests around it. The Canadian Jewish Congress is a huge lobby interest. They're there constantly. But also there are lobby interests, especially depending on where you live and what the component makeup of. If there's a large Muslim community in your area, then that can be a huge. So these are very divisive world issues. But interestingly enough, And so this is why you see all the leaders tippy-toe around these issues. But again, find a champion. So at our church at Trinity St. Paul's, Nathaniel Erskine Smith, who is a liberal, just got reelected as an MP in Beaches, East York, is coming to speak to us about how to get it on Trudeau's agenda. It is certainly not something that will happen easily in the Liberal Party, and probably won't. But here's a one-off person in that party who's decided to take a risk. And this is why I say you can find politicians in all parties who are willing to do this within his own party to put this forward. So again, find those people. And I would find him to start off with if that's an issue, because it is profoundly federal in many ways.
I have a sense, Cheri, and we talked about this afternoon, that politicians don't have a whole lot of freedom to express their views. They're all expected to be team players. They get their marching orders from the boys in short pants in the backroom office, and that they don't have much power. Is that a caricature? Am I reading that wrong?
Well, absolutely. The intimidation, you can imagine, it's like being back in high school in a sense. You know, the intimidation.
No.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I tell the story. I don't name names, but I tell the story of a federal politician who had a very prestigious position. Anyway, the party did something that I didn't particularly like. This was in the NDP, and so I said, "What happened there? Like, what? Couldn't you do something? I mean, my goodness, you have a powerful position there." And the answer was, "You think I have power? Oh, no. It's the leader's office and a couple of 23-year-olds," was the response. Now, that is true, but, and there's a huge capitalized in block letters, but, to that. And I spend a lot of my time, and I spent a lot of this last week providing pastoral care to people in politics who were everybody was unhappy with the outcome of it. So suffice to say, we were unhappy with the outcome of the federal election. And we're complaining mostly and mainly about their own parties, okay? And I said, they can't fire you. The only people who can fire you are the people who elected you. That's number one. And number two, they can't kick you out of caucus, because if they do, they lose a whack of money. So they can't kick you out. You'd have to be so egregious to be kicked out of caucus, and they can't fire you. In what other job can you say that? So by all means, speak up. So you see this with greener politicians or people who haven't found their voice yet, but you can find people who are willing to take a risk, and we have lots of examples of them, like Jody Wilson-Raybould. There are many, many examples of people in every party who will vote against their party, who are willing to stand up, who are willing to use their own voices, because basically they know they can't be fired. Life becomes nasty when you do that in your own caucus, needless to say. Just like back in high school, if you fall out with an in crowd or whatever, nightmare it is. But you can do it. Find the person who can do it and is willing to do it. They're there. Yeah.
I'm going to transition now. We could go on forever. This is so much fun, and thank you for just kind of sharing your experience. You've had a taste of this world that most of us have never had, and it's just fun to listen to you talk. Want to invite folks now to help me build a poll together. So let me find the sharing. There we go. We're going to share that one. So what I'd like to do is do some brainstorming together of potential issues that we could workshop together in our next two sessions. And as you see, I've got a sort of very basic poll here. What national issue are you passionate about? Picking up on Cheri's idea that passion is what drives these things. Or what provincial or regional issue are you passionate about? And just as you write to the chat, I'm going to fill them in. I have 10 spots on each poll, and we'll try to get as many as we can, and then we'll vote on it and see what bubbles to the top for us. So now's the time that I've been inviting you to think about. Pick up the chat, and let's see what comes out here. Okay. Hard to cut and paste when the thing bops around. It's a good thing you folks have lots to say. Oops. Okay. Gee, I don't even know what the BC Site C dam is.
Oh, I do.
That's good. That's why you're here and I'm here. So, Jonathan, is LGBTQ plus, is that national or regional you're thinking about?
Many of these issues are a bit of both. Like, for example,
I was thinking that.
Yeah. For example, affordable housing is all levels, right?
Sure.
But mainly the most money resides federally, so we can leave it there. Guaranteed livable income most efficiently federally, but I just talked about a provincial pilot project, so it could be provincial. Reconciliation and anti-racism, all levels. Of course, reconciliation more federal because it's Indigenous. Prisoners' rights, depending, there's provincial and federal prisons.
Well, I mean, some of these could absolutely go on. Some of these I'm putting in provincial could be federal as well.
Healthcare is provincial.
It's provincial, of course.
Yeah, obviously banning plastic water bottles in Toronto is Toronto, but it could be any city or any region, right?
Sure, it could.
BC Site C dam, obviously BC.
Yep.
I got a lot to say about Oregon. Defunding the police is kind of sort of. I mean, it depends. Obviously, RCMP federally.
Police, that's right. Yep.
But I mean, I think mainly people are concerned about city forces, in which case it's city. But there's usually a link provincially as well, even for city police. Treaty fishing rights, federal, right? Climate leadership, it is all levels.
Yeah, but I mean, it could be either one.
Yeah, but I mean, certainly we think federal on that. I mean, that's
We shouldn't.
We shouldn't. There's certainly a huge provincial piece there.
Okay, and I'm going to say protecting old growth forest, Keelan, is part of climate leadership. It isn't entirely, but
well, it's a BC issue too. So we could talk about how awful. I mean, there's a classic case where I can be very nonpartisan and say I'm not a fan of Oregon. So there you go, BC folk, in terms of what's going on with old growth forests and the Site C dam. I mean, what? But we can talk if we decide to do something that's BC related. I can absolutely help you talk about who you might talk to out there. Anyway, the thing now is to hone it down, right, Stephen?
We're getting there. So I now have, let's see, I have 10 on each one. We could add more and more, but we need to stop. So here's how this works, and I will stop sharing that. I am going to open the poll now, and I'm going to invite you to click the top 3 for you in each category. So you get 3 votes for question 1, 3 votes for question 2. I can't prevent you from voting 4 times, but we're Christians, so we'll be honest. It's not easy, is it?
We want all of these things.
Don't we? So we'll just keep meeting every week till Christmas. The purpose here is not to say this is the only one that's important. It's just to say this is the one we'll workshop together. But a lot of the tools that will come out of our workshopping are applicable to them all.
Can be used forever. Yeah.
I think I got a title in there by mistake under the provincial one. Sorry about that. Cutting and pasting. Thank you for avoiding it. That's what happens when you do this quickly on the fly, right? Everybody can see your typos. So far I can tell you we've got 16 people out of 24 who have completed the poll. You're allowed to vote if you want to, Cheri. I'm not. So
No, I'll leave this to
that's just fine.
you. I want to know what the folk think.
That makes sense. So it won't take your vote until you voted at least one of each on each question. We're up to 17. This is like election night. I can see the numbers and you can't.
Nobody in this neck of the woods slept on election night because I happened to live in a riding and next to a riding where it was so close.
Oh my.
And where I knew those involved. So I was like, oh.
My riding was really close too. I think there was less than 1,000 votes that separated the two candidates.
And then
so I'll give you 30 more seconds, folks, and then we'll close it off even if you aren't finished. So if you can't come up with 3, choose 1 or 2. Just don't choose more than 3 for each question. Okay, 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7. I will stop distracting you. Okay, 19 out of 24 people have voted, and I'm going to close the poll there. That's better than the national average in election night, Cheri.
Very much so.
So there's the responses, which is interesting.
So
There should be a scroll bar on the right, so you can scroll through it.
Yeah. And then
I'm seeing reconciliation and anti-racism for the national issue and climate leadership for the local one, or the provincial one.
Yeah, interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Cool. Because there is a big piece provincially for each of us. Cool. Well, so are we going to do reconciliation and anti-racism and climate?
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. So
okay, that
off
sounds
the top
exciting.
of your head, I know you have planned this for months. As we start to think our way into reconciliation, where are you going to go as you start to prepare for next week, Cheri? Who would you talk to? What would you think about? What kinds of things would you start focusing on, and the questions you might bring as you try to figure out what we might do together next week?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I hope I'm not doing it alone. I hope that we all, now that we know what we're talking about, come, like, for example, the provincial side, and there were some provincial, local, protecting old growth. There were some issues there. So So the question is, let's deal with reconciliation and anti-racism first.
Hang on a second. Sorry. Max Moore is pointing out, and Max is right, the guaranteed livable income is twice on the list.
Right.
And together, those constitute more votes than reconciliation.
Okay. So
thank you, Max.
Thank you, Max.
You're watching my typos. It's a good thing that you're comfortable.
So guaranteed livable income. Okay, so we're going to do that. That's good. Well, okay, so where I would start with that right off the bat, because we're going to start national next week, right?
Yes.
Is by talking to the woman who brought it in. She brought in a bill in the last government. My hope is she'll bring it again. That's Leah Gazan, Lakota Leah. She's a Lakota member of the Lakota community, but she focused on guaranteed livable income, which kind of ties into reconciliation because she thinks this would make the biggest difference in some First Nations communities, among other things. And we've had the experience of serve. So I'd start talking to her right off the bat. And ask what strategy there is, because I know there was a fair bit of support on both sides of the aisle for that. So I would talk to her, and I will talk to her about that if I can get her between now and then. And that's where I would start with that. But what would be great for you folk to start with is what's happening where you are. Are there groups organized already about guaranteed livable income? Is there a group in your locale where they've made this their thing? Who's working on this wherever you are? And what sorts of, for example, in Ontario, I already told you there is this pilot project that got nixed. But what are they going to be doing next? And that's Peterborough, Kingston, Hamilton, Lindsay. I mean, all of these places had groups. So I suspect that across the country, there are groups around this issue. So it would be really helpful to find out. Yeah, so people are already suggesting things. So if you could come with what you've discovered, who's working on this where you are? What's the group that you might get involved with or your church might get involved in that's working on this where you are? And because the United Church generally as a denomination has done something about it, what can we do? How can we push that forward just as a denomination would be one of my questions. Cool. Like, what do we want Richard to do about it? But then not just him, but what do we want to do about it? Like, what do each one of us want to do about it as members of the United Church, wherever we are? Because I think that could be a coordinated effort that could be really substantial there.
Thank you, Cheri.
Right across the country.
And we've got 2 minutes left in our appointed time. I imagine you would say the same kinds of things about the following week, climate leadership, and climate leadership with a provincial or regional spin. So this is not lobbying Trudeau to change our climate goals nationally. This is, what do we do with our local and regional politicians? And what advice would you give us to prepare for that as we get ready for that?
Well, certainly those folk in BC that mentioned, or those like Old Growth Forest, BC, Site C Dam, BC, I would want to know again, who are the local groups that are organizing around that? What's happening around those issues out there? We know that Indigenous are very involved in them. Where are the allies? What is a holdup? I would want to know this. I would want to, who's the environment minister in BC? And what the hell is going on there? So I would want to talk to their staff, like just ask their staff, say, and in the nicest possible way, say, I'm really concerned about this issue, and you're the NDP. What is going on here? What am I missing here? See if you can get an answer.
And I think Carol's question is important, and it's one that we need to think about as we deal with both of these issues. Mm-hmm. And that is acknowledging that we may want to be lobbying politicians. We also need to build allies within our own organizations.
Sure, absolutely.
Not everybody in the United Church is univocal on this.
Sure. But remember, you can speak as a Christian. You can speak as a member of the United Church on your own. You don't have to wait for your congregation or wait for anybody. You can say, I'm a member of such and such congregation. I'm a United Church member, and I'm a Christian. And by the way, we're still the largest Protestant denomination in Canada. You're not speaking for the whole denomination, but I'm here on my own. And I live in your riding. I mean, think of all the ways in which you are carry power with you. And of course, that's not even counting what you might do for a living, right? So if you're clergy, that's important. If you're something else, that might be important too, right?
So let me remind you, friends, when we gather in the next 2 weeks, don't avoid coming just because your issue didn't get to the top of the list. The purpose here is not to say these are the most important issues in the world. The purpose here is to say we can learn together about how to pull some of those power levers. We can learn together about strategies. We can pick the brain of Cheri and any other politician she brings along with her next week around, who are the champions and how do you find them and how do you talk to them and do the politicians really care and how do we talk to our parishioners about this and all of those kinds of questions. And the answers will be similar regardless of what issue we're actually talking about, but it helps to ground our conversation in a particular issue. So having said that, it's 31 minutes past the hour and we need to draw this to a close.
So exciting. Thank you.
This has been such a romp.
Yeah, and by the way, this is not just like we're going to do this. We want, if it's guaranteed annual income, we want to win this. This is what we want. And it's totally winnable.
A couple of people are asking me to guarantee that this is recorded and the recording will be posted. Yes, absolutely. All of our United Learning events are recorded, or just about all of them. You can find them at the recorded webinar section of United Learning, and I will get this posted sometime before Friday. I have to do the reconciliation one tomorrow morning because it's Orange Shirt Day tomorrow, and people want to watch it tomorrow. But I will get this one done second, and they will be there every week for you. It's not as much fun to watch a recording as it is to be live and ask your questions and all of that. But it's important, and it's a good way to stay caught up. So many thanks. What a great evening this has been, Cheri. This has been a lot of fun. We'll look forward to seeing you and everybody else next week.
Bye all.
Okay. Bye-bye.